Hello, my friends. This is Deepak again, and we're continuing our series on science and spirituality and much, much more. Today is a great privilege for me to welcome Tommy Rosen. He's the author of this book, Recovery, Move Beyond Addiction, and Upgrade Your Life. And Tommy is very well known as a healer, addiction recovery specialist, yoga teacher, and he's one of the pioneers in the burgeoning field of yoga and recovery. He holds advanced certifications in both Hindu and Kundalini yoga and has 23 years of recovery from acute drug addiction. You can check him out at his website at www.tommyrosen.com. So welcome, Tommy. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Deepak. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to have you. So let's actually go a little bit into your background. Tell me a little bit about your life, where you grew up, and
Yes.
little of your burgeoning into who you are right now.
Yes. Well, I grew up in New York City. I grew up as a child of the 1970s. And I like to tell people who ask me that question that I really was born into an argument. And that argument was taking place, a big argument between my mother and my father. And in that argument, there was a great deal of tension and difficulty as two people who sincerely loved life and sincerely loved people and the arts and theater and all the good things about being alive had come to great, great difficulty in their relationship, and that informed a lot about my life growing up. My experience in New York City really was one of, as a child, when I became aware or had the first opportunity to do anything, I started to become incredibly kinetic. So movement became my thing. Always moving, always on the move. Never sit still. Never be still for a moment. Athletics, all kinds of sports, always interested in the body and physicality and moving around, this kind of thing. And then eventually, food was a wonderful and amazing distraction and something that could feed or fuel my hyperactivity. So my way of dealing with the world was to move, always, and to never sit still and to never be still long enough to get to know myself. And so when I talk about my upbringing or I talk about addiction, which is my work in the world, I really talk about the lost self and never having taken an opportunity to get to know me. And it's painful for any human being not to know themselves, who they are, what they truly are, to connect to the divine within. So painful. And so we go through life trying to find ourselves in other people, in substances, in behaviors and activity, on and on and on and on and on. And we never quite figure out the riddle, because if no one is there to direct our attention inside and to slow down long enough to make this connection, we really never recover. And so I had a wonderful childhood, many happy times, lots of adventure, parents who cared about me very much, but an underlying feeling of anxiety, like an itch that you could never scratch. And you could say, well, what's wrong? What's wrong? Why can't you sit still for a moment? Just be still for a moment. And I'd say, well, if I could be honest and have that kind of awareness of that moment, I would say, I don't know what's wrong, but something always feels a little bit like it's wrong. And I'm not sure what to do about it, but my way of dealing with that is to keep moving. Or I can reach out for some sugar-filled food, later on cannabis or marijuana, later on psychedelics, later on cocaine, later on heroin. I'll reach out for something that solves that sense of something being wrong. I'll get high for a little while. I will come down and I'll return to my baseline. And my baseline is what I knew, and what I knew for many, many years into my adulthood. What I knew as my baseline was anxiety. So I returned to my low-grade, anxious self. Behind that anxious self was the true self, which I never, as I said, took really the time and didn't have the teacher or the teaching to turn my gaze inward. So I try to solve this problem as everybody does in the outside world. And it didn't ultimately work for me. But I was always a person who woke up on the bright side of things. I always wanted to be here. I was never a depressive type. Always excited to be alive and to experience many things. And it's important that I say that, because many people who deal with addiction, they come from a more depressive or repressed, angry, rageful, different manifestations. For me, it was just more that low-grade anxiety, that a sense of something missing or something wrong, or, how would I fix this? How would I? So I went through my life kind of like that. I grew up, I went to the University of Colorado. I love the outdoors and the mountains, and I experienced many mind-expanding experiences there, both chemically induced and naturally induced. For many, many years, music is a big part of my life. And so for many years, I followed the Grateful Dead and dedicated myself to that community and that experience, which was really very special for me. It is even today. And eventually, I would reach a bottom and have to change my life. And that was very fortunate. It was early in my life, around 22 years old.
All this addictive behavior was in your 20s, or when you were 22 years old. May I ask
Yes.
how old you are now?
I'm 53.
Okay. When did you finally start your recovery?
So I started my recovery when I was 22, and I reached what we call a bottom of desperation.
And at that point, what were you taking at that time in terms of substance?
Heroin and cocaine, primarily.
And was alcohol ever an issue for you?
Alcohol was always there.
Right.
It was never my first love, if you will. I like to say to people, I'd make a great alcoholic if I put any time into it. But I was distracted by other things. But alcohol was just always a part of the story.
So now tell me about the process, the recovery process that you went through.
I reached that bottom, absolutely desperate. It's the moment that your loved ones hope you will reach when they watch you killing yourself behind severe addiction like this. They're waiting and praying for you to reach a moment where you can finally tell the truth, which really is the definition of a bottom. And I finally had to tell the truth on July the 25th, 1989, when I was 22 years old. And I called my family, and thank God they were there for me. And I went off to a treatment center, Hazelden in Minnesota. I was there for 40 days. And the first half of it, it was still sort of me against the world. I didn't really land. I didn't land yet. But about halfway through that, I landed. And something happened for me. Call it grace, a spiritual awakening. A moment came where I had a tremendous emotional release with a counselor. And the idea came into my mind that it's possible that these people really want to help me. And the idea came into my mind that I really, really needed help. And for some reason, I couldn't understand why. My life had ended up in this way at this point. And I had to surrender into the arms of people who were trying to help me. And that was the spiritual awakening at that moment. And there was nothing more profound that was necessary for me to begin. So I started to take advice and I started to take their suggestions. My arrogance dropped away, my stubbornness dropped away, and I began to open to a new way of seeing things. That took place there. They introduced me to the 12 steps. They were 12-step based, abstinence based, and when I was leaving, they said, we strongly suggest you follow up this experience with daily meetings, and we would suggest you get a sponsor, and we would suggest you work the steps and go through that process. I did not do that for a year, but I was absolutely determined to stay sober. Absolutely determined. And I went back to the scene of the crime in Boulder, Colorado, where I had been. And I went about the business of going to meetings, but I didn't do any of the work. I didn't change my life at all. I'd go to a meeting, I'd check a box. And once the box was checked, I'd go back to my life. So there was this compartmentalization of my recovery and my life. And those were two separate.
What life? What life?
So my life was everything that I experienced outside of the idea of working on recovery. So the spiritual process of recovery, which is how I see it, or the holistic process of recovery, was separate in my mind. Like if you go to summer camp or maybe treatment, when I was in treatment, you would be tempted to say, oh, this is not real life. I'm stepping out of life now to do this work, and later on I'll go back to my life. So there was this lack of understanding that, and this is really critical for people who are trying to get recovery. This is your life. It's not going to become something else later. This is your life. And so what ended up happening is it had no weight for me because I gave it no value. And eventually I would start to use drugs again after 1 year. Never hard drugs again. Just cannabis and some psychedelic exploration, some alcohol. And the irony was that it was a miserable experience generally. And I reached the second bottom after a year. And that was the final bottom when I got sober for the last time, June 23rd, 1991. The first bottom is a bottom of desperation. It's a good way to get onto a spiritual path. You have nothing else, you have no other choice, you're desperate. But it's not a good way to stay on that path. You need something with more weight. And so that second bottom was really a bottom more related to self-realization of, wow, I really don't know how to live. I don't know how to be comfortable in this skin. And those same core issues that we spoke about from my childhood seem to still be here. How will I get relief from these things? And people kept saying, work the 12 steps, apply the treatment. I went to this meeting in New York City, and I raised my hand and I said, my name's Tommy. I have 1 day sober. And that night I went out to some concert and I took a whole bunch of drugs. I went back to the meeting the next day, raised my hand. Hi, I'm Tommy. I'm 1 day sober. That night I went out to a concert again, took a bunch of drugs, came back to the meeting the third day. Hi, everyone. I'm Tommy. I'm 1 day sober. And this gentleman, after the meeting, sort of cornered me. He was bigger than me. sort of cornered me up by the coffee table. And he said, "Hey, man, what's your problem?" And I sort of stuttered. He's like, "That's right. You don't know what your problem is." He said, "I bet you think you have family problems. I bet you have girl problems. I bet you have money problems." And I said, "Yeah, that's right." He's like, "Yeah, you might have those problems, but that's not your problem." He said, "Your problem is you're walking through the world with untreated addiction." And Deepak, something about the way he said it in that moment, it just hit my heart in the right way at the right time. And ever since that moment, I've been sober. And I found recovery. I worked the 12 steps. I worked those 12 steps really to the best of my ability. And the thing that I wanted to have happen, which was for my mind to change and shift, it happened for me. And then I had to face all the other forms of addiction. And that's the second part of the story of recovery. That's recovery 2.0.
Go there. I want to hear it. You're
Sure.
a good storyteller.
Okay. Well, this story is a story of recovery within recovery. Most people who approach the 12 steps, which is the most prominent form of recovery in the world, they approach it and they fall into it the same way anyone might fall into a religious path or a spiritual path. You fall into it according to your teachers. The people that are around you translate the path for you. It's no different than Christianity or any path that you would follow. There are orthodox approaches, there are conservative approaches, there are reformed approaches to all these paths. And depending upon who you fall in with, that's how you will interpret or learn that path. So for me, I learned the path from people who were quite conservative, almost to the level of orthodox, very by the book. And perhaps that's very much what I needed at that moment. And so I did the things that they asked me to do. And I used to say to them, when is it going to happen for me? And they said, it will happen for you. Just keep coming back, keep trying. Don't pick up drugs, don't drink. Keep doing the work, keep doing the writing, keep doing the reading, and it will happen. And so it did. When you remove drugs and alcohol from a drug addict's life, nothing has changed, except they're not taking drugs and alcohol. Emotionally, they're now like a raw nerve. All the things that ever troubled them are still there. Remarkably, 10 years of drug abuse, or 10 years of even just drug experimentation, didn't solve my emotional challenges. So when the drugs were taken away, right up to the surface, you get to meet you. That original feeling of lost self was right there with me. The way that I would relate to women in romantic sexual relationships, the way I would look to women for approval, for power, for a sense of worth, the way I would act out in terms of food or avoidance. At that time, smoking cigarettes, which spoke to really a discomfort in the passage of time. All of these things were there. A disconnection in my relationship with money and abundance. So things like gambling and gambling addiction were a part of my story as well. And I can remember the very famous line from one of my therapists. I came into her office on a Monday morning after spending 3 days in Las Vegas. And she said, how long are you sober now? And I said, 9 years. And she said, you still tell yourself that. I just show up at her office all tore up, worst energy possible, awful, having just disrespected my body and my relationship with the earth and my relationship with my breath and my relationship with everybody and my relationship with money. And there I was calling myself sober. Well, I was sober from drugs and alcohol. But there was another awakening waiting for me yet. And the reason I tell this story is because most people that I see in these 30 years, most people never ever move forward to the next lesson plan. And so they get to be sober, but they still struggle very, very badly in their relationships, or they really struggle with money, or they struggle just with anxiety and fear and worry and depression and all of it. Many of them end up taking other kinds of drugs, prescribed, medically prescribed drugs, in part, and I'm generalizing, but in part because they have not been able to find the next lesson plan, the next level where you could actually solve, unravel these patterns, these mental tendencies, and the difficulties of our life. And so I went through all of this challenge with all of these different addictions. And the day came where, after 9 years of sobriety, I was so unhappy. I just reached another bottom, this time in recovery. And I said to myself, I have to leave these rooms of the 12 steps. I have to find something else. I had no intention to use drugs, and I didn't ever again. But what I needed in that moment was not there for me. And I had been told time and time again, if you leave these rooms, you're going to be in trouble. If you leave, it's a bad thing. Everything that life will throw you, you should be able to solve with the 12 steps. That's what I was told. And I found that not to be true. I needed outside help. Different kinds of therapies, a lot of somatic work, getting the as we say, the issues out of the tissues of the body, the yoga and the meditation work, indispensable for this next level lesson plan. If addiction is disconnection, yoga, as you know, union brings it together. If addiction carries a sense of lack, yoga creates a sense of wholeness, oneness. Addiction is this sense of dis-ease or distance from ease. The practice of yoga, physical, but also the full 8-limb practice of classical yoga brings you towards a sense of ease. And the thing that I had always been looking for was simply ease in mind and body, connection of spirit, a sense of meaning and purpose, a way to be fulfilled in this life. And it didn't exist for me in the stagnancy of remaining in one set of teachings, which brilliantly addressed my core addiction and set a foundation for me so the next work could be done.
So then you're about 30 now, 31, when you have the second epiphany and realization. When did you get seriously into yoga and the practice?
I got sober in 1991.
Correct.
And that year I walked into my first yoga class, yogasana.
And you've been doing it since then?
Been doing it since then, but those first 10 years were incredibly surface approach to yoga.
Meaning?
Very physical, very ego, a lot of ego in it for me. More interested in feeling good in the body, but not understanding the connection what yoga could give you in terms of the depth of detoxification emotionally. The best way I can describe it to you is this. Addiction works upon a human being at 4 levels: mind, body, spirit, and in our relationship with time. At the level of the mind, anybody understands what it feels like to be at the mercy of your mind. The old saying is, the mind is a terrible master, but a wonderful servant. So the question is in yoga, how can we get the mind to serve our heart, to serve our soul? At the level of body, addiction affecting the brain, neural circuitry, the nervous system, the endocrine system, all the muscles of the body, and your complete physical experience is affected by addiction. In the spiritual sense, everybody has a longing to belong. Everyone has a longing to engage and have meaningful, purposeful existence in the world. And addiction robs you of all that possibility. And then in our relationship with time, addiction really warps our relationship with time and time space in general. So people caught in addiction, they are in a loop, and the loop is recreate pleasure, avoid pain, which is, on first glance, you think, well, there's nothing wrong with wanting to recreate pleasure and avoid pain. That seems very human. But if that's how your mind operates, and that's the loop that you're in, there's something missing. Your spontaneity, your creativity. You're stuck in the past in terms of your memory is providing images that you're either trying to recreate or to avoid, so that your future, which you're worried about, will not take away the things that you want to keep or give you things that you don't want to get. And so the real thing that's missing is the present moment. And most people in recovery even never get to that lesson. So this is what I mean by the deeper experience of yoga and what it has to offer people, anybody, of course, who earnestly seeks to establish a relationship with the present moment.
So this transition then took another 10 years from your initial epiphany, first recovery, second realization, another. So we're talking about a 30-year journey already, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I see.
Yes.
No. And now, let me ask you, are you single, married?
I'm married. My wife Kia is also a incredible and beautiful yoga teacher in the world, and she trains teachers, and she is an amazing example of study and practice and teaching of yoga. And we've been together for 20 years, from the year 2000, which was right when I was moving into the deeper phase of yoga. And she and I have blossomed in our individual lives and in our lives together in this time.
And any children?
No children, just us.
Okay. So now let's get to this book. When did you get inspired to write it, and why?
Yes. The book came through I guess what you and I would refer to as the second awakening within my journey. I met a teacher, a man who helped guide me forward. His name is Guru Prem, and he is very much alive and lives in Los Angeles. And he was teaching Kundalini Yoga and had been teaching for many decades. And he painted a vision of a kind of recovery that no one had ever indicated was possible, a level of freedom and hope and optimism, where I was not looked at as somebody who was sick, but just somebody who was discovering their true self and on that path and that journey of realization. So we went through that, and what happened for me was those other addictions gambling, acting out in relationships, and cigarettes, and all of that, after a very short period of time, they dropped away, those behaviors, through the practices and the ideas that were being given to me by this man. And in particular, I had come to him because in 2003, when I met him, when this book really began to be conceived, I had basically I had a debilitating back condition. With all the yoga and all the practice and all the stuff, a lifetime of stress had led me to this place where I could barely move. And I thought my life was over as I knew it. And I went to finally get the MRI and went to the hospital, and they said, you're going to be on drugs for the rest of your life. You have severe degenerative disc disease. You have 2 herniated discs, L3, L4, L4, L5. And sometime probably in the next year, we're going to have to operate on you. And that was a low moment, to say the least. I'm sober and I'm 36 years old, and I'm thinking, wow, my life seems to be over as I once knew it. I'm just married. And a friend of mine said to me, if you really want to fix your back, you should go see a man named Guru Prem. And at that time, my answer was no. I don't want to see anybody named Guru, anybody. I'm just not interested. Not my thing. And that very same night, my wife and I went out to dinner across town in Los Angeles, and there was a woman sitting by herself at the table next to ours, and she said, "How are you guys? I just got to Los Angeles." And we looked at her and we said, "Oh, well, welcome. What brings you here?" And she said, "Oh, I came to see a man named Guru Prem." So when I tell you that my life has been a life of second chances, my teacher would say, how much more evidence do you need that you're being looked after and that there's a purpose and there's a reason? So that happened, and I went to go meet Guru Prem, and the rest now is history. After 90 days of working with him, my back pain went away. And the first thing that he really taught me was the breath. He taught me how to breathe and how to use the breath to unravel that lifelong, low-lying, stressful anxiety. And I could finally heal at that deep, deep, deep level and begin a journey to really getting to meet myself. And then be able to pass that on through this book. So that's what the book came in another decade later, in 2014, Hay House published it. And it's just been one of those books that just continues to sell and sell and sell and sell. And when people read it, I get a lot of really wonderful feedback that it's helped to broaden their understanding of what's possible in recovery. And that's the greatest, most wonderful thing.
So right now I'm in conversation with Tommy Rosen. You've heard this very inspiring story of recovery and transformation. The book is wonderful. There's many very significant insights here, and a lot of information that is very standard and very good as well. So part 1 talks about a new understanding of yoga and its origins, addictions, aggravation, the roots of addiction, perpetuating addiction, formative years, progression. Part 2 talks about the 12 steps. Part 3 is called Birth of Recovery, Addiction by Any Other Name, Hitting Bottom to Recovery, Letting Go of My Dis-ease. Part 4, The Path to Wholeness. And here it really gets into higher consciousness, yamas, niyamas, yoga, meditation, the role of food, and discovering your purpose and mission in life. So it's a very complete and extraordinary book, which I recommend to anyone that is struggling with either low-grade anxiety, depression, emotional distress, or underlying addictive behavior, or actually very severe addictive behavior, should I say. So, Tommy, this has been a very good conversation, and I hope more people will read and buy your book. And I'd like to engage further with you later.
Yes.
Somehow, some of the yogic techniques that can apply to recovery and go a little deeper, into the nature of pratyahara, awareness of the 5 koshas.
Yes.
And then ultimately going beyond all that to the state of samadhi and freedom. So thank you for joining me. I hope you found this useful as well.
Thank you so much, Deepak. I am so grateful to you, and I would love to have those further conversations if and when possible.
We will, and we will be consulting you and sending people your way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Much love.
Much love.